Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar on DRECs. We are very happy to have so many interested professionals with us today attending the webinar. As attendees, you'll be currently on mute. Let me just, run through a few housekeeping rules before we start with the webinars. As attendees, you are all on mute at the moment. We'd like to thank for everyone who submitted their questions ahead of the webinar. Some will be addressed during the presentations. You will still have the possibility, and we invite you to do so, to ask the panelists question through the question section on your control panel. We will bring these up in the Q&A session. This webinar will be recorded and made publicly available in the next few weeks. And last but not least, as you can see from our setting, we are, during the pandemic, all broadcasting from at home. So please bear with us in case there's any technical hiccups or the like. And with that, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar and introduce our panel. My name is John Altenried. I'm with South Pole. I am the host of today's webinar. With us are Vanessa Meiler-Fels, Director, Energy and Innovation from Microsoft, Antoine Predour, Head of Climate Finance from Responsibility. We have Sam Parker, Director at Shell Foundation. We have Jim Walker, Senior Director for Sustainability, Sustainable Energy for All, and Paul Needham, co-founder of Positive Capital Partner. He is Positive Capital Partner, together with South Pole, are the implementation partners of the DREC initiative. We will hear from Paul first, going into a bit more detail and context of the DREC initiative itself, followed by Jim Walker setting the broader context and regarding the lack of finance for the distributed renewable sector, from Sam Parker, Shell Foundation, who is one of the anchor funders of the initiative and finances, followed by Antoine, talking about impact investments and how instruments like the DREC might bring a new angle to that. And finally, from Vanessa, talking about corporate leadership when it comes to bringing fueling the energy transition outside developed markets. At the end, we'll wrap this up with the Q&A. And again, please pose your questions in the question section of your panel. And with this, I give the word to Paul. Paul, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Just getting my screens organized here. So in the audience today, we have corporate sustainability leaders, climate investors, standards organizations, renewable energy project developers, technology providers, and more. So thank you very much for joining us and for taking an interest in this new initiative. Our mission is to accelerate the energy transition in emerging markets, a mission that I know we share with many others on the call today. And we care about this because access to clean, reliable electricity delivers a very wide range of benefits. Some of the benefits go directly to the end users, the families and small business owners who enjoy safer homes, safer streets, more productive businesses. And some of the benefits of clean electricity accrue to people far away from those solar panels around the world. Clean, carbon-free electricity delivers value for everyone, everywhere, because it contributes to a more stable and hospitable climate. Corporations have an important role to play in the energy transition, and many of them are already embracing that responsibility and taking climate action. Consider the Science Based Targets initiative. Over 1,000 companies have signed on, setting clearly defined commitments to reduce emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. Consider also the RE100 movement, where global companies are committing to power their businesses with 100% renewable electricity. These are not empty pledges. These companies are committing to bold new targets, committing to action plans, and committing to report publicly on their progress. And they're making progress. Corporate renewable power purchase agreements increased 18% in 2020, despite the pandemic, totaling over 23 gigawatts of new power. When corporates purchase renewable power, they also acquire the renewable energy certificates, which they cancel so they can prove that their actions and investments caused new renewable energy to be generated and delivered. They use those renewable energy certificates, or RECs, to reduce their Scope 2 emissions under the GHG protocol guidelines. Climate investors are also leading the way. Sustainable finance hit a new record in 2020 at $730 billion, a 29% growth in an otherwise very difficult year. And this is really just the beginning. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative is a network of over 30 global investors with over $9 trillion in assets under management, and they've committed to align their investments with the achievement of the Paris targets. Just yesterday, the European Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, with 275 members and 35 trillion euros in assets under management, launched a new net zero investment framework. Climate finance is growing and its growth is accelerating. And yet, set against this very upbeat picture of rising climate ambition and climate action, we must face the persistent and vexing problem of expanding access to sustainable energy. We are not on track to achieve SDG 7 by 2030. Nearly all of those bold corporate actions on climate and nearly all of that climate finance is being deployed in developed countries. Not enough is being directed to assist the energy transition in emerging markets. And for those of you like me that have been working in the energy access space for some time, you will recognize some of these very practical challenges to scaling up investment in distributed renewable energy. Our goal in establishing the DREC initiative is to build a link between SDG 13 and SDG 7, to build a link between bold climate action and the end of energy poverty. The initiative is motivated by a single question: how might we help corporates and climate investors achieve their climate goals while also accelerating the energy transition in emerging markets? The link we are creating is the DREC, a distributed renewable energy certificate. A DREC is an energy attribute certificate that represents 1 megawatt hour of distributed renewable electricity. A DREC also carries with it all the additional data about when and where that electricity was generated, who was impacted, and what sort of benefits were delivered to the end users and their communities. The DREC platform will facilitate the aggregation of energy data from thousands, ultimately millions, of small-scale distributed renewable energy systems. And for those buyers that want additional levels of verification, the platform aims to establish compatibility with the IREC standard and quality labels such as the Peace Rec. Our vision is that corporates and climate investors will use DRECs to help meet their climate commitments and to invest in the energy transition globally. There are many possible use cases, and we're already exploring several opportunities to pilot the instrument. For example, Nigeria's Rural Electrification Agency is building new solar plus storage for colleges and universities across the country. In this case, corporates could purchase DRECs from the projects, helping to deliver renewable energy and higher education. In another example, we're working with financial intermediaries to create a new investment instrument that will use DRECs to strengthen the value proposition for their investors. We believe that DRECs, if well designed and widely adopted, could address many of the practical challenges in financing the end to energy poverty. Long-term purchase agreements from credit-worthy buyers can help bring revenue certainty to DRE projects. The sale of DRECs to global buyers could provide new hard currency revenue streams, helping to mitigate some of the foreign exchange risks for global investors. The DREC platform, which will be open source, will lower the transaction costs of aggregating large numbers of small systems and projects. And improved project economics combined with lower risks could help mobilize more domestic lending. None of this is proven. These are our working hypotheses, informed through discussions with multiple corporates, stakeholders, and contributors. We have to make this happen. The DREC initiative is a not-for-profit, multi-stakeholder, industry-led initiative to create a global market for distributed renewable energy. Together, we are designing, delivering, and demonstrating new ways to certify and value distributed renewable energy attributes. Special thanks to the organizations that have provided funding to the DREC initiative, the Good Energies Foundation, the Shell Foundation, the N-Access Foundation, Signify Foundation, and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the UK government. We invite you to participate in the process and to follow our progress. So please contact us to learn more. And finally, a special thank you to Jim and Sam, Antoine and Vanessa, and to your organizations for your active contributions to the DREC initiative already, and for joining us today to offer your own perspectives. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And with that, we come to our first guest speaker. Sam, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Apologies, I thought Jim was coming first, but that's fine. Thanks very much. My name is Sam Parker, Director of the Shell Foundation. We are an independent UK charity, and our mission basically is to build investable businesses that expand energy services to people without access, which today is over 1 billion people. And we do that by funding and co-creation with entrepreneurs who have found ways of reaching people that hitherto have been unable to be reached with energy services. So if I take a step back and just think about where the market is now, I would say that over the last 10 years, we've seen an incredible amount of innovation from the entrepreneurs who effectively have found ways, using technology mainly, to reach people in new ways, in a sustainable way, with services which really change people's lives in incredible ways. However, the overall size of the market is still relatively small. I think what the generation of early stage companies have shown as well is that it is now possible to imagine that universal access can actually be achieved, and the economic growth that goes with it. And in a way that's both green and inclusive. And that's important, because there's been a dilemma in recent years about whether it's possible to achieve the economic growth in emerging markets at the same time as keeping a lid on or even reducing carbon emissions and hitting the goals of the Paris Accord. I think this generation of renewable DRE companies has shown that's now possible. We're just completing some research which is going to actually quantify the reduction of carbon emission, which will happen with two different pathways. One which is a business as usual extension of the grid based around fossil fuels pathway, and a low carbon pathway, which basically means a rapid expansion of the DREC industry. And the carbon delta is really very significant. So all of a sudden now we're looking at a scenario where distributed renewable energy is not only a priority for development agencies, but it's also a priority and an opportunity for climate investors. So that means that the social and economic benefits from access to energy have now combined with the climate benefits to really create a very strong rationale and indeed urgency to invest in distributed renewable energy. In fact, we think that without climate investors investing in DRE, it's quite unlikely that the SDG 7 will actually be reached. That is the significance of this discussion. The sheer quantum of capital that's required, we don't believe is going to be enough from the development agencies and private investors and impact investors who are just looking at the energy side. So now we're really talking about not only energy impact, but climate impact, all rolled up into one. And of course, the challenge is that the industry is still very fragmented. If you look at the number of companies out there, they're all relatively speaking, in context of the whole market, they're relatively speaking quite small. It's still an early stage industry. And if we're going to be able to attract significant quantum of climate investment, then there needs to be some aggregation, because up to today, the only way that climate investors have really been able to get involved in the market has been through large-scale infrastructure. But if you look at the off-grid, the distributed renewable sector, where the unserved are, it's very, very difficult to find a single deal or a single transaction that has any scale. So therefore, aggregation is absolutely important. The other thing that's important is some sort of mechanism to measure the generation. There needs to be, we've felt for a long time, there needs to be a universally accepted, credible way of measuring DRE generation, such that it become actually a marketable currency. That's what really got us talking about the DREC with Paul and his team and with South Pole. And we felt that this is absolutely needed if this market's going to grow. We need to make that connection between off-grid energy, a just transition, where you have an inclusive transition, where you bring people along with that transition. We need to make a link between that and the investment community. And we feel that DREC is one of the absolutely essential pieces of the jigsaw. So we believe it has to be credible. It needs to be absolutely measurable, trustworthy, and I think that I'm incredibly impressed with what the teams have managed to achieve in a very short period of time in terms of putting all the pieces together between the standard side of it, the technology side of it, interacting with the different corporate buyers and the impact buyers and the institutional buyers, because each have a slightly different interest in how they would approach this and how they would invest in this. But I think that Paul and the team and South Pole have done an incredible job so far. So well done to you guys. But I do think it's a question of urgency now. I think if you look at the 2030 goals, if we don't manage to find a way of making this off-grid distributed renewable sector open and investable to the corporate and the impact investing community, I think it's going to be a huge lost opportunity. I really don't think we're going to get there. So again, just to summarize, I think this is absolutely essential. We're committed to supporting it, and I want to thank some of the other organizations that have seen the sense in this and seen the importance of this and come around behind it to support the initiative. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sam, for highlighting this link and the urgency and the commitments that your organization shows here. Our next speaker is Jim Walker. Please, Jim, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jan. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thanks to the South Pole team, and thanks to Paul and the DREC team for inviting us to speak today. My name is Jim Walker. I work with Sustainable Energy for All. And in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to do my best to cover 3 messages. The first one is that there's not enough funding on the table to end energy poverty, to echo Sam's comments earlier. Message number 2, that push for corporate leadership on renewable energy, I think, could be an energy poverty opportunity, an opportunity to direct some of that funding to where it's needed. And the third message is the next 3 years and possibly the next 12 months, 12 to 18 months could be an opportunity to help generate ambition on that opportunity. So on message number 1, not enough funding is on the table to end energy poverty. We are in the 5th year now at Sustainable Energy for All of tracking in a fairly detailed way with our partners at the Climate Policy Initiative flows of finance to countries with the highest energy deficits. There's a series called Energising Finance that you may be aware of. There's a series of reports which are downloadable on our website that really go into the detail. The funds committed currently that we're seeing, and this has been a consistent message across all 4 years of the research, funds committed to the 20 highest impact countries, so the 20 countries that are home to 80% of the world's population without electricity access. Those funds are only about a third of what's needed. So if you look at the IEA's projections, about $41 billion a year of annual investment required. As of the last report, which covered figures from 2018, it was about $16 billion. So only about a third of what's required is actually committed at the moment. When you start to delve down, it starts to look more daunting than that. So number 1, the funds are not being committed to the countries where the impact would be greatest. So within sub-Saharan Africa, 14 of the 20 countries, 70% of the population without access only gets 20% of the committed finance. So already you're seeing a big mismatch between the finance on the table and where the biggest impact could be. When you look at technology, it's a similar picture. So the commitment of investment by technology is not a match with the highest social and energy poverty potential. So worryingly seeing fossil fuel commitments increasing. 2018 was the largest portion of fossil fuel commitment within the high impact countries, within the countries with the biggest energy access gap that we've seen in 6 years. Financing for grid-connected renewables declined for the first time in 2018 in a trend. And then financing for decentralized solutions, which should be the lowest cost and fastest way of closing the energy access gap, less than 1 to 1.5% of the total amount committed. So really only a tiny fraction of the money on the table going to where it can have the biggest impact. And that's just funds committed. So, you know, for all kinds of reasons, largely related to a mismatch of risk appetite, the need for more technical assistance, more policy support. About 40% of the funds that are committed are not making their way through to projects. They've been delayed, they've been held up in intermediary banks. And so there's a sort of really strong message coming out of this that we need not only policy reform, but we also need to be adopting more sustainable with a small s and innovative business models and financial instruments to match the money that's on the table with the needs of the projects on the ground. My colleague Christine Ives-Singer, who leads a lot of this research, talks about this in a very compelling way, which is that matching the colour of the money to the colour of the project. So the types of risk appetite of the funding are clearly not matching the needs of decentralised renewable energy in the countries where it's most needed. So that's the first message. Message number 2, push for corporate leadership that we're seeing at the moment on renewables could be an opportunity here. And this is why we're tracking closely and helping on the DREX initiative. I was involved in the early stages of setting up the RE100 group of companies, currently 290 companies pushing for 100% renewable energy. We launched it in 2014 with 4 companies, and it's grown incredibly quickly since then. The target, I think it's 315 terawatt hours per year that Paul mentioned earlier, which is the energy demand of the 290 companies signed up, actually matches the terawatt hours per year that you'd need to close the energy access gap at tier 3. So you could bring basic energy services to 890 million people with the same volume of renewable energy that's been targeted by the 290 companies leading the way on this. What's interesting is if you were betting on success for the RE100, I think you'd say it was pretty much a done deal. You know, I think highly likely they're going to get there. Most of the companies aim to reach 100% by 2030. It's about 3/4 of them, which is the SDG 7 target. The closing the energy access gap still feels like a moonshot. So for the same volume of renewable energy. And what's interesting is looking at some of those companies as they're starting to get close to 100, the bits they're struggling with are the countries that maybe start to overlap a bit with the high impact countries. So the sort of getting to 98% or getting to 90% is easy. Procuring renewables in the countries where they're still struggling with the energy transition is tougher. And so creating some kind of mechanism like DREX to link that demand for renewables with the potential supply of mini grids and solar home systems. It could be an opportunity to match needs on both sides. So that's, I think, a really big opportunity. Just last closing point in the last 30 seconds. So the next 3 years, I think, could really help generate ambition on this. COVID recovery, there's a really strong focus on powering healthcare facilities now, both to respond to COVID in the next year or two, also to protect on sort of future resilience. There's a real challenge around the financing of decentralized renewables for healthcare facilities in terms of generating OPEX, generating revenue that can help with maintenance of panels and batteries. A steady stream of funding from something like DREX could really help on that front. And so there could be a way maybe early on to link to powering healthcare facilities and piggyback off the strong interest in getting energy both to healthcare facilities and to vaccine cold chains in the next few months. There's a high-level dialogue, first high-level dialogue in 40 years happening in September at the UN General Assembly. There's a push for energy compacts and new commitments from private sector and from governments on closing the energy access gap in particular, and using something like DREX to sort of build that link between sort of international corporate appetite and the need to close the energy access gap. September could be an opportunity there. And then COP27 next year will be in sub-Saharan Africa, and COP28 will be in Southeast Asia. So we're really seeing strong convergence in the conversation now between the need to accelerate the energy transition on climate with the need to meet the goals of Goal 7 and closing the energy access gap. And I think if we're not able to have a holistic conversation around ending energy poverty and solving climate change, it's going to be very tough to do either. And so again, I think this opportunity to link the rapid progress we're seeing on climate-driven renewables procurement with this gap on energy poverty is a big opportunity. I'll stop there and hand back to you, Jen.
Thank you very much, Jim, for highlighting this urgency and the call for action. Our next speaker, Antoine Bredour, will shed a few words on the investability and the associated risks and the steps that are needed on this side. Antoine, please, the line is yours.
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. I hear a lot about, yes, the funding gap. There is much more capital needed to finance the sector, and indeed the direct initiative could be quite useful for that. A brief word on responsibility. We are an impact investment manager. We invest mainly in private equity and private debt in 3 sectors: financial inclusion, sustainable food, and climate finance. We are only active in emerging / developing economies, and we today manage around 3.5 billion. 1 billion is invested in climate finance. And if I look at the decentralized renewable energy market, today it represents around 250 million. So only in a way 250 million out of the 3.5 billion. And the question is, how can we raise and deploy even more capital to the sector? I'll come back to that in a minute. The reason we exist is that, and why responsibility has been created and why impact investing is needed, is that basically traditional investors or local banks, in the case of the countries we're operating in, often are reluctant to finance the sector. The business models are complicated, the risk is difficult to understand, but also most of the project developers, especially the early stage developers, they lack collaterals, they lack guarantees, they lack track records, and this is something for investors like us, which is quite difficult. Also, last but not least, when you invest in developing countries, in emerging economies, you face not only a credit risk, but you also face what we call country risk. There is a war that could happen. There's a lot of devaluation or currency movement that could also have a big influence on the credit risk of the project. So that's something which is quite important for us when we analyze a project. Sometimes you have great developers, but they are located in countries where there's a lot of instability, and that's difficult for us as a commercial investors. We raise capital most of the time in USD and invest in countries where local currency is needed. So that's something which we always try to see and check how we can invest in those sectors. When I heard first about the direct initiative, I was very excited. Why? When we finance the energy access sector, which is mainly today solar home system, mini-grid, or what we call commercial and industrial solar projects, we finance assets. Sam spoke about aggregation of projects. This is what we do. We look at the different projects that those project developers would like to develop. We put them into, most of the time, on a SPV or a certain vehicle. And we ask the project developer to put some equity in this SPV to, in a way, protect the debt that we are going to provide in an SPV, but also to mitigate the credit risk, obviously, but also, most importantly, the currency risk, which is, I think, a very important risk, as I just mentioned. Having this additional source of revenues for those project developers or those solar home system companies or mini-grid companies could really help them getting that extra capital which is needed to put into this or to invest into these SPVs, so that we as a lender could have some security and basically some risk buffer into the SPV that we are financing. So I really was excited when I heard about this greater initiative from South Pole and Positive Capital, which I think has a lot of potential. Other ways of thinking could be also that the direct will provide additional revenues to the project, so that increase the credit worthiness of the project. What does that mean? It means that the project can negotiate better conditions, lower interest rates. It can also, and that's very important in the sector, especially for mini-grid or CNI solar, it can negotiate longer term maturities, because most of the time when you work in those markets with local banks, they would provide you with very low maturities, meaning 2-3 years, where the payback period would be maybe 6, 7, 8 years. So having some risk buffer and improving the creditworthiness of a project would enable us to provide longer-term maturities to the project. Another way of thinking could also be that this additional stream could fund a debt service reserve account. I explain myself. When you sign those loan agreements, we ask some of the projects to basically deposit some money into a reserve account so that it can serve the debt that we have provided and repay partially the debt progressively. This is something that could be super interesting because this revenue could then be put into this account, and then when they need to repay the debt, they already have provisioned part of the money that could go to and repay the lenders. Lastly, I think that this additional source of revenues could be put into or set into an escrow account, which could serve as a guarantee to the loan that we would provide. So in case there's a default, we as a lender could access that source of capital, which if they repay back the loan fully, then they can basically get back and use that capital for other projects. So in short, we are quite excited about this. As I said, we have, I think, a significant amount of capital to deploy in the sector. We are quite keen to do even more than what we are doing today. This initiative is a very good and I think strong initiative. I hope that it will be understood by the project developers, by the companies, that they will really. I mean, I think there is a word of education a bit from our side, also as investors, when we come and when we discuss financing terms to really explaining what is it about. We see more and more projects that, let's say, the most sophisticated ones already know about renewable energy certificates. They know about carbon credits, but I think the earlier stage company, there's some work to do there to educate and really make this great initiative known. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Next, we are very happy to have Vanessa on the webinar, and we are keen to hear of some of the bold and innovative leadership that Microsoft has taken on this journey, and we are keen to hear what might be needed to foster and to facilitate further such leadership. Vanessa, please, the line is yours.
Thank you, John, and also I want to thank Paul, Sam, Jim, and Antoine for really setting the stage on why energy for growth and distributed energy is a key piece of the puzzle to meet the SDG 7 and 13. It's a pleasure to discuss with you how companies like Microsoft could contribute. In January 2020, Microsoft committed to be carbon negative by 2030. And so I want to tie kind of our contribution to distributed REC and energy for growth or energy access in emerging countries with our commitment and try to explain why there is a link. Our commitment to remove carbon, more carbon than we emit every year by 2030, so to be negative, is bolder than net zero commitments, carbon neutral commitments. And in addition, we've also pledged to remove from the environment all the carbon that Microsoft has emitted since its founding in 1975, and we would remove that by 2050. It's kind of mind-blowing to think that we're already a 45-year-old company, 46-year-old company. Why did we make such a bold commitment? Well, we asked ourselves two questions that I think are really linked to the energy access problem that was laid out. First, are we doing enough? And the answer was quite simple. It's no. I mean, and this was just looking at Microsoft, but also obviously looking at the science and listening to what the IPCC was saying. Microsoft has focused on sustainability for more than a decade, and we're proud of the numerous achievement we've made. I mean, we've increased steadily the percentage of renewable energy that our data centers rely on. We've been carbon neutral since 2012. We've created a carbon tax internally at Microsoft that we charge all of our business groups. But when we look at what needs to be achieved to put the world in a 1.5 degree pathway, we knew that we needed to do more. And really at the foundation of our commitment is the idea that those of us that we can afford to move faster and go further should do so. And also we want to put the technology at the center of this, and really financial innovation at the center of this. And the second question we ask ourselves is, how can we make a difference? And we believe that if we really focus on all the ways we can drive change, we can make an outsized impact on climate change. And we will need to pull all the levers of influence we have. We will need to work on our operations, obviously, as a customer, as a supplier, as an investor, as an employer, as a policy advocate, as a partner in innovation to other customers, organizations, and institutions. And so why, if we're focused first on our operation, because our carbon negative commitment really looks at our scope 1, 2, and 3 for those that are familiar with greenhouse gas accounting, and I think it's kind of at the core of all of this. Scope 1 is the direct emissions, scope 2 is the indirect emissions from the electricity we purchase, particularly for our data center and our facilities, and scope 3 is the emissions from all of our value chain. And so why, if we're focused on scope 1, 2, and 3, are we investing in energy access in regions where we may not have operations yet, and where we don't necessarily have a big value chain footprint? Well, I think this is again related to, are we doing enough, and in the impact of what could be the impact of our contribution? And energy equity is, of course, a key consideration. We believe that our procurement decisions can help reduce environmental and energy inequities. And so last year we purchased the first ever Peace Rack. Paul mentioned the Peace Rack as one of the instruments kind of under the broader umbrella of distributed REC. The Peace Rack are issued by the Energy Peace Partners, and the project was with Congolese solar developer Nuru, and it was a 1.3 newly commissioned megawatt commercial solar plus storage project in Goma in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The purchase helped Nuru install and operate 35 mini-grids, connected streetlights in a neighborhood of Goma. We decided to invest in PREC, even though it did not fit perfectly our scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon reduction commitment. But we want to figure out a way for companies like us that are looking to procure renewable energy to invest in regions that are the most impacted by climate change and that are currently deprived of access to modern energy, or for which the green premium would be too high to shift to clean energy and would still be reliant on otherwise fossil fuel energy if they were to get access to reliable energy. We believe that we can maximize really the impact of our investment, not only from a carbon reduction perspective, but also from a climate equity perspective and from a social perspective, from a health perspective. And that's also where I think we come in from a data company perspective. We think at the climate energy nexus as a rich nexus in terms of data, and there's just a lack of data transparency today that we hope we can contribute to really surface and fill. And these PRECs or DREC, as Paul mentioned earlier, are quite interesting because they will really try to label not only the megawatt hour, but another series of data factors that are quite critical to make it relevant for the communities we want to invest in, but also for the impact investors or for the companies like Microsoft. But because PRECs and DRECs are not really instruments that are fully commercialized. I mean, we were quite at an early stage. There was little guidance on how they would fit into existing corporate sustainability reporting frameworks like the CDP or the RE100 that Paul mentioned earlier. And I think we do face a few challenges to grow these investments in the regions where we would maximize social and carbon benefits by displacing diesel generators and by providing reliable, sustainable energy to those deprived of it right now. The first challenge is really to close the gap with the accounting protocol and initiatives like RE100. Because today, those greenhouse gas protocols and RE100 are looking at locational or market emissions. And so if our facilities are not in those markets deprived of energy access, we cannot account the benefit of the carbon reduction our investment bring into our corporate sustainability accounting reports. And doesn't necessarily prevent us from doing it, but it definitely decreases the value of the business model. And that's really where we see that the work of the DREC initiative is leading is critical to remove these barriers and to bring the right stakeholders around the table to enhance the business model, to grow the interest from other corporates, and not and ideally really not to limit it to a philanthropic initiative, because as everybody around this panel showed, there's a big funding gap, and we may not close that funding gap if we just rely on the philanthropic side. And so bringing all the equation of the carbon value, the social value, and the fact that carbon is a global phenomenon, as Paul made this in his intro, closing that loop would enable really the enhancement of these business models. So very excited to be part of this initiative and to see how we can contribute further from a financing perspective, but also from a policy perspective. We also believe that DREC have a value not only in emerging markets, but also in the US and Europe. I mean, in more mature energy markets. I think when you look at all of the IEA energy transition roadmaps, there is a role for distributed generation. And today there's very limited instruments, again, for companies like Microsoft to support this distributed generation. And so we also did a few initiatives in developed markets, for example, in Ireland. So there is a complementarity in what we're doing here, obviously with a focus on emerging markets, to the broader energy transition of the globe, really. Thanks. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Also, thank you for attending in spite of feeling a little bit under the weather. Very much appreciated. Thank you for showing these insights on the importance and the challenges of the corporate leadership and why we need to address that. And with this, we come to the Q&A session. Let me start with the most frequent question that we were asked ahead of the webinar, and give you a moment to digest the presentation before we take the ones submitted in the chat. I see that we are running slightly short of time. Please allow me to extend this webinar by 5 minutes to address as many questions as we can. The first question I'd like to ask to Paul. We've been asked, how will the initiative be implemented from a technical standpoint? Meaning, what hardware, software will be needed or required? What systems are you building this initiative on? And will existing installations be eligible to participate? Paul?
Great question. And whoever asked that, I hope you get involved to help us answer those questions. But part of the work of the task force of the DREC initiative is to take stock of the technologies that are already available and successful. The Odyssey platform, the Angaza platform, for example, already pulling in data from solar home systems and solar mini grids. We're also working with the Energy Web Foundation that has developed a fantastic distributed ledger technology for tracking and recording energy attributes such as renewable energy certificates. So we're working with all of these partners to understand what technology is already there and what new pieces need to be built to connect and to enable this new instrument.
Thank you, Paul. Another question is, will the DREC initiative be supporting clean cooking? And allow me to answer this myself. We've been looking deeply into the clean cooking. It is very clear that this technology, as its growth in variability, addresses a very important issue linked to climate change. Many of the current systems are equipped with remote monitoring with a high degree of digitization and would technically qualify to participate here. Although we don't exclude the future part of that, we are currently focusing on the renewable side, hoping that the technical platform that we're building with this initiative can later be used also to track other impacts from associated technologies such as clean cooking. Whether this will end up on one platform or separate is not for us to say or decide, but we are providing a basis work that we hope to also serve these purposes. Another question that was a bit extensive, let me rephrase that. How do we expect to measure the impact DRECs will have on the end users, or how will we ensure that the revenues generated through the DREC will benefit the local communities and the off-grid society? This again is a technical question. Paul, allow me to pose that to you again.
Well, I was wondering if Sam is still on the line. I can't see everyone's camera, but I think Sam, the Shell Foundation has done an enormous amount of work to understand and to track impact. I wonder if that's something you might be willing to comment on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I think one of the critical ways of accelerating access to energy services is to drive down cost to serve. As of today, it's still very, very expensive to serve customers that are very remote. And most of the, a good proportion of the underserved or people with literally without access are living in quite distributed rural contexts. And to get services to those consumers, it's tough, which is why which is why some of the new technologies have been so effective. But even today, it's quite marginal as a business. So if we could just generate 10, 20, 30% more efficiency into the cost to serve, the expansion of service would be really, really dramatic. And one of the ways that you can do that is actually by monetizing the social and the climate impact. At the moment, all that impact has been generated for free. It's a benefit for the country. The government's not paying for it. There are no buyers for it. It's simply being generated. So I see the DRECs has been a way to actually drive down the cost to serve. So to answer the question, what is the benefit for the consumer? The benefit would be that a lower price for the energy and affordability would expand access to many, many more people, because the companies would be able to, if you like, reach many, many hundreds of thousands more consumers. And that is really the benefit we're after. And the benefit of access to energy, I don't have to tell you, is manifold. It's really the first step out of poverty. It's generating enough economic growth, it's education, it's health, it's access to all of the basic services. So there's a lot of data around the benefit, but I think the key thing that DRECs can do is to accelerate that social impact through driving down costs and bringing in more capital into the cost of goods.
Thank you very much, Sam. Indeed, please.
If I may echo this, I think that's an important statement from Sam. This would, as I explained briefly, allow the company to lower the cost of funding, and that those savings are basically going to be back and sent back to the customers by lowering the cost of the services. So that's a chain, and I think that would be quite important. And you lower the cost of funding by improving the creditworthiness of the project, and the DREC can really help there. So yeah, that's an important initiative for not only the financiers, obviously, but for the population that will be using those services.
Thank you, Antoine and Sam, on this comment. This indeed really supports the motivation behind this development of ours. I'm very sorry. There's more interesting questions coming in. We make an effort to answer all of these. You will receive them in the mail out after this of this webinar, and we'll also include some of them on our webpage, as they really point out many technical questions which we believe is good to be understood by the community. And in respect of the time, I'm afraid we need to bring this webinar to an end. We'd like again to say a big thank you to our speakers. Further thanks go out to our funders who enable the work of the DREC initiative, but also to our collaborators. We are permanently looking for partnerships, so please do get in touch with us if you'd like to engage directly with the DREC initiative. Thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.